everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis, a breaking news reporter here at Forbes. Joining me now is Dan Wang, Eurasia Group's China Director. Dan, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Since he was sworn in, President Trump has repeatedly ratcheted up tariffs against China. And almost 100 days into his second term, I'm curious exactly how you would characterize this moment we're in right now, when we're seeing this giant tit-for-tat trade war continue between the world's two biggest economies, the United States and China, with seemingly no end in sight.
Well, we have been anticipating the tariff war or the tariffs escalation since Trump sworn in, but the scale and the speed of these tariffs are still beyond the market expectation, especially for China. So at this point, I think it's safe to say that China-US relation is beyond salvation. And there will be a lot more that Chinese government has to do to counter the hit of this tariff. And also for the US economy is also running this possibility of a recession or even inflation. So I guess for the global market, investors have to be really careful for the rest of the year.
I think that's a really grim outlook that this relationship is beyond salvation. And I want to talk exactly where this relationship is, because in an interview that was published last Friday, President Trump said that President Xi did call him to talk about this escalating war. China has straight up refuted that on Monday. This is what China's Ministry of Foreign Affairs spokesperson reportedly said, quote, "As far as I know, there has been no recent phone call between the two heads of state." And he also added this, quote, "I want to reiterate that China and the United States are not engaged in consultations or negotiations on the tariff issue." What does this indicate to you, that relations are frosty at best? Because there's not only different characterizations of what's happening. I mean, one person's saying one thing and one person is saying, hey, that is not even the case, not even a little bit.
Well, we know the style of President Trump quite well now. And for the two sides, they haven't been really on the same page for a number of months. And regarding this tariff issue, President Xi has been quite strategic, but President Trump has been very chaotic. So if we have to pick one side to believe, I would rather be on the China side. It doesn't matter what President Trump's end game is. For China, this is not the right way to enter a negotiation. And President Xi would never allow himself to be in a similar situation as President Zelensky, to be humiliated in front of the domestic audience and a global stage. So I don't think there is any chance for immediate talk between the two sides. But that being said, by the end of this year, given the mounting pressure coming from the tariffs, I think China and the US will figure out a way to at least de-escalate from the current level of the tariffs.
The United States' Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, he said that repeatedly that where we're at right now is unsustainable. That's what you're saying too. Can you give us a picture here of what the tariff game is doing to China's economy right now?
We just published a note on the tariff impacts on Chinese economy. So even by the most conservative measure, those tariffs will shave off at least 2 percentage points of the GDP growth. And this year, the official target is 5%. And that means if without additional stimulus plan, China could only reach 3% of GDP growth. And that's not politically acceptable. Although to other countries, this might sound big, a big number. But for China, the main problem is that there has been a loss of confidence since the COVID lockdown, and the economy hasn't really recovered from that pessimism, and also the housing downturn. So for the government, it really has to do a lot more to assure the market that it could contain the financial stability, it could contain the job market deterioration. So we expect an additional 2 trillion RMB of fiscal spending on top of the 12 trillion RMB planned. So that is a very daunting task, and it also means the local government debt will be once again piling up.
I'm curious what you see are the implications for the rest of the world here, because in the same breath that President Trump slapped dozens of nations with reciprocal tariffs, just hours later, he did end up pausing those. the same moment he did turn up the heat on China. And then we saw that tit for tat trade war where China has imposed the 125% tariff. The United States has imposed that 145% tariff. And it seemed like President Trump is really trying to isolate China from the rest of the world. And the spokesperson for China's Commerce Ministry reportedly said this on Monday, quote, China firmly opposes any party reaching a deal at the expense of China's interests. If such a situation arises, China will not accept it and will resolutely take reciprocal countermeasures. What kind of spot do you think this puts the rest of the world in? Do they have to pick one country over the other in this trade war?
It certainly seems so. And for any middle power and smaller economies that highly dependent on China, they're not in a very good spot at this point. President Xi has been touring around ASEAN countries, trying to convince other countries to be on the same page. It is very difficult because the U.S. is nonetheless the largest destination for a lot of those countries' goods. And for China, it is so important as a center for manufacturing, and its investment in those countries, especially its neighboring countries, ASEAN, Greater Asia, or even Latin America, is quite crucial. So, for any of those countries deviating away from China or de-risking from its powerful neighbor, it's simply impossible. For the US, at some point, there is a limit on how far this tariff can go because the domestic pressure is real. So even for President Trump, it could drag this trade war maybe for another few months. But before the inflation ticks up, and also he's pressuring the Federal Reserve to lower interest rate, that's even higher pressure for inflation. So he also needs China, needs China export. And I don't think this whole thing will spin out of proportion like this until the end of the year. And for many of the transshipment countries like Vietnam, Cambodia, they're in a particularly vulnerable position. But there's no other way around. They still have to depend on China for its manufacturing and depend on the US for its market.
The word that's been thrown around a lot in this is uncertainty. Businesses don't like uncertainty. Trading partners certainly don't like uncertainty. And a guest on the show just a week and a half ago, he was in Vienna and he said he was surprised to say it, but China at that point, he thought the other world is seeing China, the rest of the world rather, seeing China as a more trustworthy trading partner than the United States. From your vantage point, do you agree with that, where the rest of the world is looking at China more favorably right now than the US?
The rest of the world have higher trade dependency on China, especially after COVID. We can see this trend clearly. The trade dependency on China has been increasing, even for countries like Europe, or even for the US, because it's all about stability. Whenever there are some acute variability, volatility in the market, China is a reliable source to turn to. And that type of supply chain power cannot be built overnight. We could always figure out a way to generate a demand out of thin air, but supply chain means years of investment and also a highly trained staff, a highly educated workforce to make that happen. And for the US, its trade policies have been quite chaotic. Of course, it's losing a lot of trust from even its allies. So I'm not surprised that other countries see China as more reliable. But when it comes to the long-term partnership, it's a very different story. China might seem reliable as a trading partnership, but when it comes to security or even ideology and other aspects, China's status hasn't really changed, and the other countries also have to choose carefully.
I'm curious where you see this going because, like I said, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent says this is unsustainable. China has reportedly said that they will not negotiate under duress. But Scott Bessent also said that he believes the ball's in China's court. He believes they need to come to the table to de escalate the situation. Does China see it that way?
From the China perspective, it's absolutely the opposite. So China will, under no circumstances, to be on the negotiation table under coercion. And for the U.S., they have, probably I should say President Trump has a style to force other country to come to the negotiation table and under the U.S. terms. But for China, this is more to answer the domestic audience rather to answer the US, it can all look weak. And even for those escalation period of the tariffs, you can clearly see that change. And the domestic audience, the general public, really welcomed this change in China's response to the U.S. tariff escalation. And there is no other way around, really. For China to get a deal with the U.S. without compromising its basic principle, it's a very delicate balance because what the U.S. want or what President Trump wants is one thing for more Chinese companies to directly invest in the U.S. rather than exporting to the U.S. And then the second thing for China to eliminate the trade balance, and that's practically impossible without a severe revaluation of the RMB. So those terms have to be negotiated under a lot other conditions, and China needs to also be able to feel comfortable enough to discuss this because it is a serious compromise for its domestic stance.
Aside from a trade war between the world's two biggest economies, it does seem like there are egos at play where no one wants to appear weak. No one wants to be the person to blink first here. If China's saying, I'm not coming up to the table and I'm not certainly coming under duress, President Trump says he's not picking up the phone to call China first. He has substantially dialed it back a bit. He said that the tariff rate will come down substantially. It won't be at zero. He said that last week. But where is the off ramp here?
Well, people have been talking about the Mar-a-Lago Accord, and we do not believe that type of concession could happen, at least on the China side. There might be, though, a goodwill from the China side if somehow both sides can work out a term to really reel back the tariffs to the April level. And if that happens, maybe there can be some mild revaluation of RMB. We have given now that scenario. So even with a 15% revaluation of RMB, that is about 15 to 20% of the trade deficit taken off on the US side. It is a win for Trump. It is also a win for China. And for other type of concessions, it's very difficult for China to do because there is still the overcapacity. Those goods has to go somewhere. If it's not US, it's the rest of the world. And then that's a very different pressure. So, of course, many of the companies that I talked to already have plans to invest in small scale in the US under this pressure because their standard, their machinery are designed for the US market. It's impossible to just toss that all away. But this type of industrial relocation to the US would take several years, and it's certainly not in the type of scale or quality that US consumers are looking forward to. We have to realize that at a reasonable price and relatively high quality, China and the Greater Asia is the only option for a lot of the high-end equipment and electric machinery. It's impossible to get around.
So I am curious. My last question to you is what specifically are you looking out for next? Because is a lot that remains up in the air here. But are there any indicators from either the US side or the China side that will give you hint to maybe larger things?
Well, we're still sort of in the hope to see a summit happening in June. Maybe both leaders can finally find a chance to get a phone call or even sit down. But that's a long shot. So we now put down the year-end tariff to be in the range of 45% to 60%. That's very much the market consensus, since people don't believe anything higher than that is sustainable. But China's stance is very firm. I don't think we could see the bilateral relationship to go back to the pre-Trump era. And this is the long-term competition rather than just the short-term battle. China's economy now is very much gearing towards the domestic circulation. So the domestic market, domestic production are way more important than the external market. And the US is dividing this world into two camps. And I believe this trend actually will deepen. The whole trading system under WTO is basically throwing away into the history. The China-US competition now is way beyond WTO framework. And I don't think the old system can really fit this new reality anymore.
Well, there is certainly a lot to look out for, and I hope you come back down and break it down for us as we see developments underway. Dan, thank you so much for joining me. You are welcome back anytime.
Thank you.